Brianna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, unfortunately, we're all too used to hearing government actors make excuses for their own incompetence, but it does seem like they're getting more and more absurd with the excuses they come up with. In the wake of the Silicon Valley bank run and bailout, the Wall Street Journal's own Andy Kessler, along with several conservative politicos like Ron DeSantis, attempted to blame wokeness for the bank's failure to anticipate the risks associated with holding large amounts of bonds during periods of high interest rates. But for most Americans of all political backgrounds, there really didn't seem to be much of a connection between the existence of, say, one black or gay person on the SVB board and the company's choice to go without a chief risk officer for most of last year. So now there's a new rationalization being bandied about by Democrat Barney Frank, one of the chief architects of the post-2008 Dodd-Frank legislation that was designed to prevent financial crises exactly like the one we experienced in 2008 and similar to the one that occurred earlier this month when SVB and Signature Bank went down. The argument that there wasn't really a problem with the banks. Rather, the government merely chose to shut SVB and Signature Bank down because they have it out for crypto. All right, though it seems most financial experts blame a series of deregulatory actions taken under the Trump administration for the crisis. Deregulatory actions, by the way, which were supported by a number of Democrats. Barney Frank doesn't think his own legislation would have helped. In a series of interviews he's given since the banking crisis, he said that his own legislation that squarely would have required risk assessment for the very types of investments that tanked Signature Bank would not have changed the outcome. Quote, "I don't think that had any impact," he told Politico. He said his bank, Signature, was in, quote, "good shape," and that his bank was, quote, "an unfortunate victim of the panic that really goes back to FTX. If it hadn't been for FTX and the extreme nervousness about crypto, this wouldn't have happened," says Frank. But is that merely a cope, as the kids say? Does Barney Frank have his own agenda? Now, keep in mind, after decades in Congress inveighing against the corruption and exploitation endemic to the financial industry, Barney Frank joined the board of Signature Bank, one of the two banks at the center of this crisis. In an interview with the New York Times that aired on their daily podcast on Tuesday, Frank claims that there was no conflict of interest. Here's how he described the bank's hiring pitch to him.
So you were approached by Signature Bank. What was their pitch?
They thought I was smart, knew a lot about banking, and had the right values. They also stressed to me that they were the leading user of the low-income housing tax credit. They knew that housing had been my single biggest substantive policy.
Now, although Frank frames his choice to join the Signature board in part as based on his longtime commitment to affordable housing, he goes on to admit that he thinks he deserves to participate in so-called revolving door politics because he sacrificed so much potential corporate lawyer salary as a Harvard Law graduate.
I wanted to earn money. I had no pension. I had voluntarily decided not to get into the pension plan in '81. I didn't want to lobby. So I was looking to earn money. I had been making money from speeches, and I had a good advance. I got a $500,000 advance to buy my memoir. But I was planning to live for many more years, and I was looking for an ongoing source of income. So about $325,000 a year, which I must say for, it sounds a little arrogant, but for an honors graduate of Harvard Law School, $325,000 a year is not an excessive salary.
It would be refreshing if it weren't so galling, that honesty there. Frank earned over $2 million while serving on Signature's board for about 7 years. So it's worth interrogating the timeline to see how all of these incentives actually lined up with each other. After playing a key role in post-2008 bank regulation, Frank retired from Congress in 2012. He joined Signature's board in 2015. In those last years of the Obama administration, Republicans had begun to focus on dismantling Dodd-Frank, and Frank was brought before Congress to defend the legislation, which he did. But importantly, he also included in his commentary the following unsolicited opinion, that the $50 billion cutoff for bank regulation under Dodd-Frank was too low, and that as a consequence, it caught up too many small banks that, in Frank's view, presented no real risk to the financial system. Remember, Frank was now on the board of a bank that was very close to reaching that $50 billion cutoff. Now, Republicans and some Democrats start citing Frank for this very proposition, that the $50 billion cutoff was a mistake. And when Trump took office and gained control of Congress, Frank's clout was weaponized to pass the deregulation that arguably caused Signature Bank to go out of business earlier this month. The $50 billion cutoff was raised to $250 billion after the deregulation, and the number of banks that were regulated under Dodd-Frank went from a few thousand to 1,000. Moreover, the size of banks like Signature grew at a rapid pace post-deregulation. SVB quadrupled in size in 4 years. The size of Signature Bank, Barney Frank's bank, doubled. Now, Frank admitted in the New York Times interview that the original Dodd-Frank had kept the size of banks in check, but refused to acknowledge that the deregulation had any effect on this crisis. He wouldn't admit that liquidity requirements would have made a difference, or stress tests, or any of it. In fact, here's how he closed out the interview.
One of the great pleasures of leaving elected office is that you are no longer subject to an impact from the opinions of people whom you do not respect and do not know. You know, at this point in my life, I don't care.
So there you have it. Another lesson in dodging accountability brought to you by one of America's two corporate parties, this time a Democrat. Luckily, there are important reforms being pressed by some politicians who aren't focused on what Barney Frank is calling a plot to bring down crypto or wokeness gone amok. Bernie Sanders wants to ban bank CEOs from serving on regional Fed boards due to the conflict of interest there. The SVB bank chief sat on San Francisco's Fed board. And Elizabeth Warren is calling for an investigation into what really went wrong and for lifting the FDIC insurance cap. Still, it would be nice to see some critique from Democrats and Republicans alike about the pernicious consequences of revolving door politics and the complete impunity with which members of Congress use their positions to enrich themselves while lobbying against the interests of ordinary Americans.
Yeah, the Barney Frank example seems particularly powerful. Sets the regulations, exits Congress, gets to serve on the board of the bank, and is defiant about his right to make all sorts of money.
Yep, it's really telling. Like, I think that he's kind of in his I
think he got into politics for the right reasons, though.
He's doing it to save low-income housing.
Yeah.
Look, he's clearly in his I'm retired. I'm an older man. I'm in a honey badger doesn't give a fig. I don't remember that meme from a few years back. Like, he's in that phase of his life where he just doesn't care, and so he's being weirdly honest and frank in these interviews, but people should take that as an opportunity to really see behind the curtain of what goes on in politics. I mean, we did an interview with Ro Khanna today, and he had to go, but there were some other questions I had because he's been accused of, lobbying Steve Ricchetti directly at a gridiron dinner here in D.C. for the Biden administration to step in and bail out the SVB banks. He's a representative from Silicon Valley. His constituents there are very invested, for obvious reasons, in the survival and the bailout of these kind of financial institutions. But what does it mean when Ro Khanna is lobbying Steve Ricchetti, who in turn was so criticized when Biden picked him to be a senior advisor because he himself had spent his entire career in the pharmaceutical industry, and the revolving door goes around and round and round. So, you can't get away from this kind of stuff. I just wish at some point when someone says something as honest and transparent as what Barney Frank said in this interview, there was some pushback. There was some critique from his former colleagues in Congress. Instead, it seems to be hands-off because ultimately everyone's wanting to preserve their ability potentially to leave Congress and do the exact same thing. They made this horrible sacrifice of having to take just $175,000 a year in salary from the American people.
Look, I certainly don't want to destroy crypto. I have expressed a lot of interest in crypto as a way to get around actually the ups and downs of the government-managed banking sector. I think I'm optimistic about the technology, the kind of Sam Bankman-Fried catastrophe notwithstanding. So I think I would find it more plausible that this was like a concerted effort by big banks to crush a rival. I would be more persuaded by that if there wasn't the, simping for bailouts going on from a lot of people in the tech sector right now.
And this is an important part of that hypocrisy. When Barney Frank was arguing that the $50 billion cutoff was too low and capturing too many small banks and that it should be raised, the argument that they were using was These banks are too small to have the catastrophic effects across the entire American economic system the way the big banks that failed in 2008 did. So the express argument was these banks are so small that it's okay. They don't need the same regulatory barriers on them because they can't really hurt the broader economy. And when this crisis then happened and they were arguing for bailouts, the argument was flipped. You have to bail us out, or otherwise this is going to have crazy effects across the American economy. And the hypocrisy is plain. You just can't have it both ways.
Yeah. All right. We'll have more Rising right after this.